Institution that caused misery to millions and evoked shame in even more.
They were all there.
All there, yes.
Oh, how awful for them.
For the poor, the homeless, the unemployed or the ill of Victorian Britain, there were no welfare benefits and no NHS. They could starve on the streets or turn to the workhouse as a last resort.
When he died in the workhouse, was his body chucked out with the rubbish?
Astonishingly, the workhouse survived well into the modern era, until after the Second World War. In 100 years, it was home to over 16 million people caught between poverty and destitution.
She was homeless and living on the stairs.
Are you joking?
No. So,
You're joking?
No.
By the time it finally shut down in 1948, 5 million people had died in the workhouse. Today, 1 in every 10 Britons has a family connection to this formidable institution. But amongst the stories of tragedy, there are also stories of triumph against overwhelming odds.
That is absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah, Western Australia.
Extraordinary.
Now, actress Felicity Kendall, actor Brian Cox, presenter Fern Britton, and best-selling author Barbara Taylor Bradford will explore how their families were driven into the workhouse by poverty. An ordeal with uncanny echoes of life in today's Britain.
The injustice of it is astonishing. It's astonishing.
And model and actress Keira Chaplin will discover how the most famous workhouse inmate of all, her grandfather Charlie Chaplin, took on the system and won.
After going through this, he probably realized that he could get through anything.
Victorian Britain, an era of rapid industrial growth, but also a time of soaring population and economic upheaval. The workhouse was adopted in 1834 as an ingenious solution to the spiralling problem of poverty. The idea was simple: humiliate the poor for asking for help, shame them into standing on their own 2 feet. In one extraordinary case, it worked. Charlie Chaplin went from the workhouse to not only stand on his own 2 feet, but to become a Hollywood superstar and one of the wealthiest men in the world. Charlie's life began here in Lambeth, in what was once one of the poorest parts of 19th century London. His granddaughter is the actress and model Keira Chaplin.
My grandfather lived here with his brother Sidney and their mother Hannah. From what I know, my grandfather grew up very poor. Hannah was a singer and she lost her voice. They struggled to find food, and I know that one of the most traumatic things that happened to my grandfather is when he had to go to the workhouse.
To qualify for help, a poor person had to satisfy the authorities that they were truly destitute, that they had no money, no job, and no place to live. Charlie Chaplin's alcoholic father had deserted the family when he was aged 9. And in July 1898, Charlie ended up here in Lambeth Workhouse with his mother and half-brother.
What would have happened to Charlie, Sidney and Hannah when they first arrived here?
Well, they would have approached the workhouse, and Hannah would have made it known that she wanted to be admitted.
Okay.
At which point she would have been separated from her 2 sons. So she would have been led to the female ward, which was on this side of the building.
Okay.
And the 2 boys would have been led across the way to the children's building.
So as soon as they're in, separation right away.
Separation straight away.
Segregation was at the heart of the workhouse system. Children from their parents, wives from their husbands. By isolating individual groups of paupers, the authorities believed they could contain the toxic influence of poverty and stop the spread of degenerate behavior.
We can see from the map of the workhouse just how regimented it was. Not only do we have the male side and the female side, but there's a further Victorian designation of good and bad. This was an attempt to try to make sure that good people were not somehow punished by close proximity to bad people.
Yeah.
The architecture was designed to judge people, really, I think.
Yeah.
To make it
to judge them and make them feel bad about themselves for being there and to scare everyone else from wanting to go there.
Absolutely. This was meant to be terrifying, so that you would do anything you could to avoid it.
When Oliver Twist famously asked for another bowl of gruel, he was hit about the head with a ladle. But Dickens wasn't exaggerating the brutality of workhouse life. To minimize the welfare bill, the system was designed to make sure that life on the inside was worse than earning a pittance on the outside. Hollywood actor Brian Cox made his name in blockbusters like Troy and The Bourne Identity. His great-grandfather, Patrick McCann, was just the type of person the authorities wanted to target. A Glasgow labourer who, like 1/3 of the city's population, managed to survive on the poverty line. But in 1897, Patrick succumbed to the Scottish version of the workhouse, the poorhouse.
It's weird because one of my greatest fears has always been poverty. And it's something I've always had, this fear of it. And when you see a history of it in the family, you begin to realise it's in the DNA.
Patrick was one of thousands of Irish immigrant workers who had flocked to Glasgow in the hope of finding work after their own country was devastated by famine. He lived in the Cowcaddens area, one of the city's poorest districts at the time, with his wife and their 8 children.
He was living in tenements like this, his family, with 40 to 50 other people in one tenement.
40 to 50?
Yes. So massively overcrowded compared to the present day, obviously.
Yeah. So how would they be divided up?
Where you would have one room, a fireplace, and one bed, and that was it for a whole family. No heating, drafty, damp.
By the late 19th century, Cowcaddens had one of the highest infant mortality rates in Europe. 1 in every 5 children died of poverty-related illnesses, including 5 of Patrick's own children.
So this is your classic close,
It is.
or tenement stair.
We all recognise this, don't we?
We do know this very well.
Annie has a record which shows just how desperate things got for Patrick's family before they turned to the workhouse.
I have this document to show you, which is actually for Sarah Maguire, who was Patrick's mother-in-law.
This is my great-grandmother.
Yes. Now you see, the bit I want to point out to you is residence, Charlotte Street, on a stair. And what that basically means is she was homeless and living on the stairs.
Are you joking?
No.
You're joking?
No.
On the stairs?
So she was sleeping, if you like, on these hard stone stairs. We talked about Patrick and his family living in these very overcrowded rooms, but poor old Sarah was on the stair.
I mean, did they not take her in?
The McCanns were having their own major difficulties at this time, and they couldn't support her.
At the turn of the century, there were over 100,000 people in Glasgow alone living in conditions similar to the McCanns.
Family structure seems to have been destroyed. It seems to have been eradicated. It seems to have been... Because, there's cannons to the left of you, cannons to the right of you. It's all around you, there's despair. And we're constantly applying for poor relief and constantly trying to keep ahead of the game. And, I talked earlier about my own fear of poverty, but I now know where it lies, and it's a reality. It's right in the system. It's there. Because what they went through, and just... It just leaves you... It's really bad, It's really bad.
By 1900, economic expansion had made Britain the richest nation on the planet. And yet, almost 1/3 of the country's urban population lived in poverty. To control the number of poor becoming dependent on what would be called welfare benefits today, paupers had to pass what was known as the Workhouse test. In order to qualify for help, they had to be prepared to work 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, on mind-numbing, tedious labour like breaking rocks or picking apart old rope. Inmates were treated like prisoners, but the workhouse wasn't a prison. The door was always open, and people were free to leave if they wanted. But for 1 in every 10 who came in, the only way out was in a coffin. This is what happened in presenter Fern Britton's family.
Now, I have got a copy of the death certificate of my great-great-great-grandfather. And he has the most marvellous Christian name of Friend. He's called Friend Carter, and he died in the workhouse. And whatever he did well, because we're all right now. That lovely name, Friend.
Like a quarter of the population of Victorian Britain, Friend scraped a living working on the land. The upheaval of industrialisation and rural unemployment led to riots throughout his home county of Kent. But despite this turmoil, Friend was a model worker and managed to stay out of the workhouse even in old age.
Right, so here we have the 1871 census.
Yes.
Can you see who we've got on there?
Ah, yes.
There's Friend Carter. And can you see what he's doing
It
there?
says
Agricultural
agricultural
labourer.
labourer.
So he's still working at the age of 64. And it's hard work. It wouldn't have been easy for him.
God, what an extraordinary man.
And he's living with his daughter Harriet at this time. People relied on each other then, especially in the family. The family unit was very, very important because there was no backup, really.
There's no other pension, no income, nothing.
No, that's right.
To the Victorians, the family unit was sacred. By threatening to break up families, the workhouse played on the worst fears of society. But even the strongest families were defeated sometimes by poverty. In 1879, the youngest of Friend's 10 children, Jessie, was taken ill with angina, a heart condition. The workhouse was one of the few places the poor could get free health care. And although conditions inside were dire, Friend had no choice but to take his son there as a last resort.
Oh my goodness, yes.
So that's when he was...
January 1879. Carter Jessie, age 23. Date of discharge, April. So January, February, March, April. So he said 3 or 4 months.
Yes.
Well, that's good. He didn't go there any longer then.
Ah, yes, but then we found him in the 1881 census, and he is in hospital in London.
Oh, gosh. So Friend must have been worried about him.
Jessie's medical condition was so serious he was transferred to a London hospital. But what Friend didn't know was that this would turn out to be a fate worse than death. The earliest workhouses appeared in the 17th century, but it was the Victorians who first used them as the basis of a national welfare strategy. At its peak, there were 700 workhouses in England, housing over 250,000 people. Each was run by a master and matron, and the largest ones, like Lambeth, held over 1,000 inmates at a time. Charlie Chaplin came here as a child with his mother Hannah and his half-brother Sidney. Today, the building has been converted into a cinema museum in Charlie's honour. In this very room, now used for screening films, Charlie and his brother met up with their mother 1 week after they first arrived. Charlie gave an account of that reunion in his autobiography.
How well I remember the poignant sadness of that first visiting day. The shock of seeing Mother enter the visiting room, garbed in workhouse clothes. How forlorn and embarrassed she looked. In 1 week she had aged and grown thin, but her face lit up when she saw us. Sidney and I began to weep, which made Mother weep. Eventually she regained her composure, and we sat together, our hands in her lap, while she gently patted them. She smiled at our cropped heads and stroked them consolingly, telling us that we would soon be all together again.
But the family's moment of reunion was to be all too brief. After 8 days, Charlie and Sidney were sent to a pauper school on the edge of London, leaving Hannah alone in the workhouse.
A week or two later, Hannah ended up in the infirmary with what's described as dermatitis and bruises all over her body. She's somehow been victimised, picked on, hit. We don't know whether it's by staff or by other inmates, but she's physically suffered some kind of abuse.
In the workhouse infirmary, Hannah would have had her wounds cleaned and dressed. For her pain, she would have been given opium.
How many days did Hannah spend in the infirmary?
It seems she spent about 9 days here, and then after a couple of months, she was transferred from the workhouse to Cane Hill Lunatic Asylum.
Wow, so basically 7 weeks after being here, ends up in the insane asylum. This place sounds like hell. Horrifying.
Officially, physical punishment wasn't allowed, although unofficially, abuse was commonplace. This is partly what made the workhouse such a feared institution. But the torment of life inside wasn't just physical. It was also psychological, as inmates were stripped of their dignity. Barbara Taylor Bradford is one of Britain's highest-earning novelists. She is best known for her rags-to-riches saga, A Woman of Substance, the first of a series of books featuring illicit affairs and skeletons in family closets. Recently, research for her biography revealed that Barbara's own family history concealed a secret from her mother's past that could have come straight off the pages of one of her novels.
I first found out that my grandmother, Edith Walker, and my mother, Frida Walker, had been in the workhouse. And I never knew any of this, but I received the manuscript of my biography, and I couldn't believe it. I actually burst into tears. This is the only photograph my mother had of my grandmother, Edith Walker, and she looks like quite a young madam there with a hand on her hip and the lace collars and cuffs, and she doesn't look like somebody who's poor.
Edith took Barbara's mother, Frida, to Ripon Workhouse in Yorkshire when Frida was 6 years old.
I really cried one day because I couldn't imagine my mother, who was a very sweet and rather reserved woman, as a little girl put in the workhouse. And then it leads to that awful question, why?
The workhouse was so hated that many poor families stuck together through thick and thin to avoid its clutches. This was the case with Fern Britton's family, until a heart condition forced one member, Jessie Carter, into a Kent workhouse for treatment. Jessie's condition became so bad that he was transferred to a London teaching hospital.
I don't like the idea that we're in this operating theatre. Was he alive or dead? What happened?
No, he was alive when he came here, but he was a very sick person when he came here. And unfortunately then, he dies on the 1st of May. And given the amount of pain that he's in, it was probably a relief, actually, that he'd gone. Now, the hospital is very keen at this point to obviously find out why a young man like that would have died, of course, because we're in a period when there's a limit. Absolutely, and all these people are standing around here.
Oh, you're going to tell me he was here being post-mortemed?
Yes, he was here being.
Oh.
Yeah. And it's at this point that he could go for further medical work. And it really depends on the family. So if they've got enough money, then his body will go back to them and they will take care of it. If not, then he'll go off for dissection. And in fact, many medical students in this room would have paid extra money in order to dissect someone like Jess.
So poor Jessie, he's died, the message gets down to Kent. And what do the family do? We know they're on the breadline.
From their point of view, this is a huge question for them, because it's not just about the body, but it's also about Jess's afterlife, because that's the belief at the time. And what they were most frightened of was the sort of things that would happen in these photographs, because as you can see, dissection doesn't just mean slightly cutting the body, it means cutting it a lot, because obviously you're learning